Capital punishment. This is a legally authorized killing of someone as punishment for a crime. The main idea behind this is that wrongdoers deserve to be punished with an equal amount of severity as the crimes they have committed. Capital punishment is a form of retributive justice, a broader system of criminal justice based on the punishment of offenders rather than their rehabilitation.
The death penalty was first used in 1608 to execute a commander in Jamestown accused of spying for the Spanish government. It was suspended much later in our nation's history from 1972 to 1976 due to a court case for Minnesota, Georgia, which found that it was being applied in an unconstitutional manner. States later started reinstating the death penalty, and it was upheld only for cases of murder in 1976 with the Gregg v. Georgia case. In 2002, it was determined that the death penalty cannot be applied to mentally retarded inmates, which it had been before. And since 1976, 1,411 people have been executed in the United States. 1,256 by lethal injection, 158 by electrocution, 11 by gas chamber, 3 by hanging, and 3 by firing squad.
Our interest in the death penalty began when we were marathoning Game of Thrones to prepare for the upcoming new season. While watching the execution of Eddard Stark, we began to wonder whether execution or capital punishment was an action that could be morally justified.
This led us to a real-life example. On May 16th, in 1958, Jeffrey Dale Tyner was born. He would later kill a man and be given the death penalty just one day after his 42nd birthday. James Samu, who invited Tyner's girlfriend and her children to share a Springfield home while they looked for a rental, was beaten, stabbed, and shot after a pizza party at the house in 1993. Tyner's girlfriend, Carolyn Eckloff, was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison for her role in Samu's death, as she incited Tyner by falsely accusing Samu of being a child molester.
This is an important aspect of the case, as Jeffrey Tyner was abused as a child by his mentally ill father. It would only make sense that he'd harbored hatred towards child molesters. According to the petitioner's trial memorandum, Tyner was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, specifically attributed to traumatic childhood abuse, and it should be kept in mind that when Tyner was killing James Samu, he was killing someone who he thought was a child abuser.
This made us question the morality of the death penalty and whether or not retributive justice is really helping society. This led to the knowledge issue, in which we examine how different ways of knowing attribute to the morality of ethical decisions such as capital punishment.
Let's take our first way of knowing, reason. Viewing the death penalty from the lens of reason reveals multiple facets to this ethical dilemma, one of which is the finality of death. A study conducted by Stanford University found that about 4% of people sentenced to death in the United States were later found innocent, which is about 1 in every 25 death sentences.
As seen in our example shown, the actual murderer is able to get away while a bystander is accused of the murder. The bystander ends up getting executed, and once the execution is over, there is no way to reverse this action.
Another aspect of reason lies in the cost of sentencing a person to death. In the United States, the cost of the death penalty far outweighs the cost of a life imprisonment, largely due to legal expenses and the high security imprisonment of inmates on death row. Cases without the death penalty usually end up costing states about $700,000. while cases where a death penalty is sought cost upwards of $1.25 million. This is only the money spent for the individual cases. Keeping a death penalty and keeping inmates on death row costs taxpayers more money than not having a death penalty, which raises the question as to whether a more effective use of resources can be found.
When viewing the death penalty from an emotional lens, it is understandable that a victim's family or loved ones may seek revenge or closure from the death of the criminal. However, this question arises as to whether a death penalty is pursued and enforced because a criminal truly deserved it as justice, or because the prosecution was swayed by anger or a need for retribution. This is important because it raises the dilemma as to whether capital punishment deters crime or whether it actually furthers the cycle of violence.
A criminal who takes a life deservedly should have his or her own life taken as well. Our justice system attempts to match the punishment of the crime with the severity of the act. Therefore, the best solution to murder should be murder.
However, this can be seen as hypocritical of one of the reasons for the death penalty, which is to stop murder and the killing of other people. The emotional way of knowing also introduces the effect of bias and prejudice, which can lead to alterations in the perspective of witnesses and jurors. One prime example of this can be seen in the case of Randall Dale Adams, where he was wrongly convicted of killing a police officer and received a death sentence. It was in fact a teenager named David Harris who was the actual murderer, but because of the young age of the true murderer, Adams was wrongly imprisoned for 12 years before the error was corrected. The Adams and Harris case also highlights the effect that prejudice and individual bias can have on eyewitness perspectives and testimony.
When examining the reliability of eyewitness testimony, the biases that the witness have must also be examined. In the examples seen in the video, it is seen from the first perspective that it is impossible to tell who stole the wallet. However, because Calvin thinks Brandon looks weird and has a bias against him, he accuses Brandon as being the thief. From the other perspective, it is seen that this is true. Nonetheless, the first perspective illustrates how even a fairly concrete way of knowing, such as sense perception, can be unreliable. Both the emotional aspect of this bias and the example of how sense perception can be limited call forth the question as whether we can form a moral decision based on evidence presented to us, even whilst knowing that this evidence can be limited.
A major implication of enforcing the death penalty arises from the actual action of execution itself, as enforcing capital punishment begs the question as to who has the authority to carry out the execution. Is it the doctor that administers the lethal injection, the person who turns on the electric chair, or the members of a firing squad? Or is it the judge who passes the sentence, the lawmakers who pass the death penalty, or perhaps even some higher power? And what is it that allows these people the authority to carry out this action? If anything, it is the family or loved ones of the victim that should be allowed to carry out the execution, but this is rarely the case, especially in more modern death sentences. Another implication of this very issue concerns the psychological damage that can be inflicted upon the executioners and people who sentence the person in question to death. Killing another person can leave a lasting impact upon the psyche of the executioner, and if a case arises where the person killed is later found innocent, then the executioner and those that sentence the person to death have to deal with the fact that they took part in the killing of an innocent person. In conclusion, viewing the death penalty through the lens of emotion and reason revealed that it does not give criminals a chance to redeem themselves, and if an error is made in the sentencing or if it is later found that the suspect was not guilty, there is no way to reverse a death. Keeping prisoners in jail for life would effectively keep them from committing any further crime and with this alternative in mind, the only reasons for capital punishment would be for the victims' families' consolation or for the deterrence of future crimes. However, the long legal process of the death penalty only prolongs the victim's suffering, and there is no quantitative evidence that execution deters future criminals. Through these arguments, we found that the death sentence was morally unjustified because of its costs, the biases involved in sentencing, and the chance of wrongful persecution.